Barbara, thank you so much for taking the time today. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great, great. So again, this interview series, Life After the Bubble, we, you know, try and talk with former students about just, having like a year or two at least out of sort of this like Lake Oswego experience, just, what kind of like perspective that brings and, just try and get some like reflection, both for I think a lot of us trying to do this anti-racism work in LO, but also just for students in general, just living in LO who could, use that insight, use that perspective. So just to start, did you go all the way through LOSD or what years were you in the school district?
I moved around a lot when I was really young, and I joined LOSD when I was in first grade and completed my whole primary education there through 12th grade.
Gotcha. And can you just talk a little bit kind of in general about like what that school experience was like?
Going through LOSD is a very interesting experience, I would say, in the sense that you're in a very privileged area. You're getting a better education than most people in Oregon. And I feel like you become aware of that once you're in high school and you're meeting people from different schools. But especially as a person of color going through LSD, you do realize kind of, I think when you're young, the moments where you're just like, people here are really white. Like they don't know anything that I'm talking about. The way I'm treated is a little different. The way people that look like me are talked about is very odd in how they treat you. And people like to act like racism's gone, I would say, in LO, because we're like, oh, like we're having such a great education. Like there's no way that people can be racist. But I would say casual racism is still really prevalent. And I would say internalized racism is something that a lot of students of color in LOSD end up struggling with. And it's really prominent and it's like something you just really notice. And I would say that it's a lot. I would say it was like a struggle for a lot of people growing up.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about sort of being in that middle ground where, like you said, we have access to, this high level school that, you have access to a lot of different classes, learning opportunities, resources, but also, at least I know in my experience, it was like there's definitely this era of at least inside LO, like you don't belong here. And like
Mhm.
some of it more overt, some of it more subtle. And like you said, like some of those conversations that I mean, I'll ask you because I know with me, like I was very, introverted person, and I think a lot of people almost like took that as a signal of like they could say more like racist things or talk about things that
Mhm.
they might not say to a group of people to me. I don't know. Do you have any similar experiences like that or observe anything like that?
I would say I have something almost like opposite because I'm very extrovert. I'm very outspoken, I would say. That it's like if I got upset about something racist, it was almost like, oh, she always has something to be upset about. And it's like almost like I would say speaking out outcasts you a little bit, just in the sense that speaking out, you suddenly get, I feel like, almost stereotyped as like, oh, that angry, like person of color, SJW kind of vibe, where it's like speaking out makes you an enemy because you just like can't be happy almost. And I would say, honestly, like, even though I would say no one intentionally would like outwardly say that they would outcast you just because you're like a person of color or something, I would say you do get that vibe just from how kids tend to click together growing up with like white families meeting other white families, and these kids become best friends from first grade and do everything together. That's like almost if you're not a part of that, even if you're close with people in those groups, you're still outcasted. And then just in general, I would say that experience I would say made me introverted, but I'd say it made me a lot more closed off to people in LO than I usually am.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's interesting just when you talk about that way, especially like students of color just get isolated. And even just the casualness, I think,
Mhm.
like no one wants to outwardly identify and say, I'm racist unless it's like, you know, in some like trying to be ironic way. But I know like it felt like people were talking about, well, not just talking about race, but like just being racist pretty much all the time, except it would be, usually couched in the form of jokes or
Mhm.
attempts at jokes, like things that, and I wouldn't really call this a joke being in class where, you're just reading and like the word monkey comes up and kids like look at you. Like
Mhm.
there's no joke there, but it's hilarious to them. And it happens all the time. Uh and like you said, if you're just a person who speaks out about that, especially, which makes sense if you're dealing with it all the time, right? But like you
Mhm.
said, people will look at you and say, "Oh, you're just looking for something to get mad at," right? So,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, the things that you're pointing out, like, I understand what you mean because I feel like also, like, in LASS, when we start like, in middle school, when you start learning about racism, and there's, like, a racist occurrence in a book to someone of your race, and then suddenly you see all the white kids turn their heads towards you. And it's like, I can understand, like, yes, that person is of my race, but why are you turning the attention to me? I'm not the character in this book, so why are we all looking at me right now?
Yeah, yeah. And you said something earlier about internalized racism, which I think is really a big thing that a lot of people don't want to talk about because it's a tough conversation. But it almost feels like, especially in a place like LO, a lot of people, yeah, whether it's intentional or not, internalize a lot of these things just as a way to almost like a survival mechanism.
Mhm.
But, I don't know. I just think about it as far as it's one thing to kind of like play into the tropes or, you know, and not even play into the tropes in some cases, play into just, yeah, just a lot of the racist sentiments of your peers to kind of like fit in. But then what does that do for you you know, once you're done in LO, once you have to go and do anything anywhere else in the world, never mind, the internal psychological stuff as well. But I I mentioned that to ask, you know, where did you have anywhere you could go for community, whether it be in LO or outside of LO? Because I feel like these support systems can be very crucial in just how you come up.
Yeah, so I feel like luckily for me, I as a kid, I grew up Christian a little bit, but because of that, my parents only went to Chinese churches. And I think luckily for me in that sense that I had a community outside of LO. And even when I would say I went through my own period of really struggling with internalized racism, making myself the butt of the joke to satisfy like white kids growing up, um, luckily I was still able to find that community again with like in high school, like have a bunch of friends that live in like Beaverton, which is a lot more Asian. I have a lot of Asian friends there. And overall, like I feel like this is again like an unintentional like survival tactic kind of thing in LO is that you do find that a lot of the Asian kids who don't give themselves up to internalized racism and don't make themselves the butt of the joke for white people, they do tend to be friends with other Asian kids because it's almost like you feel safer with them because you know they actually respect you as a person.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely say that as far as just being a black student, very numbers are smaller, but very similar experience in that regard. Um, as far as I think another factor in just yeah, your quality of life in LO schools is both a combination of like supportive teachers slash mentors, but then also people who are not or people who do things that are not necessarily so helpful. So, as can you just first talk about like what did supportive teachers or administrators or mentor figures look like in your LO experience?
Honestly, I'm trying to think of like if there's any teachers that really stood out for me. I feel like there are a few, and I just feel like honestly, like the humanities teachers, like language arts and like history, if they're able to because the thing is, racism is prominent in every aspect of history and most literature, and if they're able to bring it up, I feel like that honestly made me feel a lot more comfortable. And they usually ended up being the most supportive teachers when it came to any of this. And I would just in general, I think it's important for teachers to acknowledge any form of racism that's in their subject, just because the more I'm thinking about it, every subject has like some history of racism, but most people try to brush it off or not acknowledge it, while teachers who did, specifically like English teachers or history teachers that were able to talk about it without making themselves feel uncomfortable, they were usually quite supportive and honestly like my go-to teacher if anything like happened. But I would say to a certain degree, just because most teachers are in a low are white, I still felt like not completely understood, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And as on the flip side, then what were some things that whether it be a teacher, an admin, another adult authority figure, like type of things that they might do that were either harmful or just like created obstacles for you?
Yeah, so I would say these ones stuck with me a lot more because just in this case, I felt like there were more specific incidents where I was like, wow, that affected like how I think of myself or like how other people perceive me. Because the first incident I can literally think of is second grade. A kid made like the stereotypical stretching their eyes out motion at me. And I started crying and I had a converse and the teacher, I really don't like Elo's version of punishment with this, where instead of like calling out the racism and punishing a student for racism, they instead try to give the student who experienced it like a little pep talk on confidence, as if that's supposed to fix everything. Because I just had the teacher basically tell me, she was like, like my daughter gets made fun of for like how her eyes look sometimes, but you just have to embrace it because it's something you can't change about yourself. And I would say that's something that really stuck out to me because I feel like these themes have followed all throughout LO years. For example, I remember when I was in, I think like high school, there was an incident with the black student at LOJ who had a sticky note with the N word stuck on him. And then that's the student who was sticking the sticky notes was doing it like multiple times and only had like a 1 day suspension because they have their, I forget what's called, I think it's like restorative justice, where their punishment system is rather than like actually punishing a student for their harmful actions, it's like, how about we have a conversation about why this is wrong and how we should love everybody, as if that actually solves anything.
Oh man, just again, different time period, but going to different L schools in the 90s and remembering a lot of those talks of, you know, we're all one, you know, while people would do like while teachers would literally in one case they separated me and the other brown student away from the other kids while making the same speeches. But I think you touched on a thing I've really been mulling over a lot in terms of like how we deal with this. Like you talked about the restorative justice process, and while I know that there's actual practice, with restorative justice that I'll say a lot of people they say they're doing it, but they're not doing it. So like when you talk about these, just you have these incidents and you just bring both people into a room and don't really solve anything, if that, or you talked about this pep talks. It's it's this weird resistance to actually address the racism. You know, like people are comfortable with, oh, your feelings were hurt. Can I make you feel better?
Mhm.
but the like the actual, hey, this was racist. You cannot do this. This is why this was wrong. This is, I don't know. It always feels like LO finds it's like a never ending number of ways not to do that. If that
Yeah.
makes sense.
It's like they always give this conversation like how to love yourself, how to embrace who you are. But how about we have the conversation like, why do you hate me because of my race? Like, it's just crazy to me to think about like that the way like everyone always is like solve hate with love. And while that works, how about we solve hate by figuring out why do you hate it and why are we allowing this person to express their hate?
A novel idea, right? Also, you notice like when certain, specifically when white kids actually get harmed, the response is not the same. It's not, the understanding is not there. The patience, we must all love each other. Like somehow we actually, again, people find ways to get, like I don't believe in, just a system built around carceral punishment, but it's weird how you find how, we find ways to punish people, we find ways to suspend people. Uh yeah.
Because
So
oh, I was gonna say it's like because when a person of color slips up, it's like they were waiting for it. Well, when a white kid slips up, it's like this is a part of growing. Like they just need their time.
yeah. Yeah. Like I said, like the I don't know, I've just seen different instances, whether it be kindergarten, whether it be, high school basketball, whether it be, a junior high class where again, like what people get suspended for, what people get punished for, what you know, yeah, especially like students of color who push back, how thin of a margin of error it is to really speak out at all. And even never mind a margin of error, just like if you speak out, like you talked about the, as I remember, I think this was a few months maybe into respond to racism with the junior high incident you were talking about.
Yeah,
I remember, I've watched how some of those students who spoke out about, getting notes, getting literally getting stabbed, how they were treated by the district as basically pariahs versus the people who did it. And again, this is nothing new to LO, but it's just it's wild. So
it's crazy. I feel like how they age like students of color. Like when a white student does something wrong, it's like they're just a kid. Like it's just all a part of growing up. But when a student of color does something, it's like, why did you do that? Like you're old enough that you know that you shouldn't be acting like this.
yeah. And again, we're actually I'm not gonna, I was about to go to a story about other extracurriculars, but we'll save that for something else. So, I think I first became familiar with your work through writing with the color zine. And I want to, one, would you would you say writing just in general helped you process? But then also, can you just talk about sort of like the origin story and how the color zine came together and who else was working with you on it?
Yeah, of course. So color actually officially started off made by my older sister. When I think she was a senior in high school, she made it with two friends. My older sister Phyllis Chen with her two close friends Juliana Sani and Kamala Ghana Basiri. They made it as a way to share their own personal experiences as students of color in the Lake Oswego School District. And it was actually something I thought was really cool my freshman year of high school. My sister ended up dropping it because she was going to college. She obviously got busy. Senior year, the pandemic's happening. So much is happening around. That's when I would say like people actually start in LO at least actually started paying attention to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I would say it was just a crazy time to be processing, I would say the world as a person of color and LO specifically, just because it's like, wow, like you actually, because then it's like you kind of see people talk and you're like, wow, you actually can now like see that like LO is really white. So I think for me, I've always been the type of person to just I feel like always have like a bunch of thoughts and like a bunch of criticisms about things, but I will never like outwardly say them directly towards the person just because it's like a little bit of like a confrontation fear thing. Again, could be rooted by Ella's way of treating with confrontation when it comes to racism. So for me, color was a way that I could indirectly just be like, this may sound a little bad, but like look at how you guys have affected all these other people, all these students of color, and you guys just all brush over it. It was kind of my way of just like indirectly writing to Lake Oswego students, Lake Oswego teachers, everything. Um, so I was interested in starting a color again for that reason, just to have this outlet almost to share my thoughts without having to like deal with, I would say, the repercussions of when you actually confront a white person and they start getting super defensive like, I'm not racist, I just and they start stammering and trying to come up with bullshit excuses as to why they're not actually racist. And so I did it with two of my friends who I know who are also great writers and also passionate, Serena Lump and Cameron Azuka, and we worked together to bring this magazine back. And we published one issue before life got its hold on us again. But I would say I'm very proud of that issue and the work we put into it, because all three of us did end up writing very personal stories of being students of color in LOSD that I think that is one of my more impactful pieces I've ever released, just because I feel like people started to understand that, like, oh, these stories of racism aren't just things you hear on the news or things that you kind of know about, but people you know are experiencing it as well, which I liked because it didn't require me having to deal with directly talking to someone and defending my right to exist in Lake Oswego.
Yeah, yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about kind of like the responses you were getting? I know a big part for me during my time was being a columnist for the Ella Review. And I think in addition to like people in the school you know, getting emails and letters from people in the community, some positive, some, as you can imagine, not very positive. But, you know, it kind of made me feel like, okay, this is, you know, I like my thoughts are actually being engaged with. And like that, I know that definitely gave me some confidence just in writing in general, but then also specifically in like again, saying as someone who's definitely much more of an introverted person, it gave me a lot of confidence as far as like, okay, I can engage the community on this. There's a path for that. So yeah, can you just talk about some like what was the what would you say is kind of like the general response, and not just like we talk about the issue of color, but then also you've done some columns for RTR as well. So yeah, can you just talk about how people have responded?
I would honestly say the responses are like positive and negative to a certain degree. Because I would say a lot of the people that did end up reaching out, they were like, we really love your writing, like, we really support what you said. But then it was like, how much do they actually support me? Because we ended up wanting to share our, like, expand our audience. And there was actually a LO administration that was like, oh, we're willing to share it. And we were like, okay. So we sent them the link and we were like, here, we finished editing all color and we actually published it. Like, we would love if you would share it with the community. And then we started getting a little bit of like BS excuses of why they couldn't. Because then they were like, oh, like there's curse words on the cover, like it's not appropriate. So then we were like, Serena actually went back and took the time to unpublish the work, go back in and censor the curse words and then republish it, only for us to then get a real response of why they didn't want to share it. And it's because we used the term ACAB, which the administration just saw as so offensive and so controversial. And I thought this was honestly a little offensive because they said, how do you feel using the term ACAB, something that I see like gangsters and pubs use? Which then I was like, why are we being compared to gangsters and pubs now? Like, communities, like people communities of color that are using ACAB are because people like them are getting wrongfully arrested, killed, hurt by cops. But it's suddenly wrong for us to say that this institution is flawed and that they're bad. And suddenly we're gangsters for doing so.
Good God. Yeah, it's the fun part about, I'm not gonna call it the fun part, but doing these interviews, like we all have, probably a laundry list of like, wow, that person said that out loud moments in
Mhm.
LO. Yeah, gangsters and pubs. That's my new one for the day. Wow. Um, so now you're at, actually, I want to stay here for a second because I think the police issue, especially, uh, wait, where were you going to school when have they put SROs in when you were going to school?
Yes, yes, they did.
Hey,
Which
can you
is
talk
also
about,
another interesting topic.
yeah, can you just talk about that experience? Like what, like, I don't know, as a student, does it make you feel safer having a cop running around the school?
I'm gonna be honest, I felt like they did nothing for the school. Like, what about them made it safer almost? Because I remember we did have a lockdown because two people came in that were like police officers, but I guess they were off duty and they had guns, but they didn't go through the proper visitor. And I would visit like visitor, like check in or whatever. But like, what was the SRO doing? Like, what, why? And then I just feel like every story I've heard about the SRO, I'm like, how are you like benefiting the community? Like, you sound like a personal assistant. And then that's like the only positive stories I hear are like, oh, he helped us like get a speaker, which I'm like, okay, um, sure, an amp is fantastic, but I think the negative stories are like much more impactful, and that's where I'm really like, so why do we have these again? Because I hear more about SROs getting students in trouble at Lake Ridge, which if you look at Lake Ridge's student population versus LOHS's student population, the big difference is in like the number of people of color that actually go there. So it's like, how come Lake Ridge is having all these incidences while LO is having like none that I hear about? So I personally haven't really had any interactions with the SROs, but I can't say that the good things I've heard of them really outweigh the bad things.
It's interesting you say that because, yeah, again, just being in this RTR space, parents, students have reached out, and every anytime, and I guess to be fair, it's a complaint process, so of course it's going to be negative, but I have yet to, from students anyway, really hear much on the positive end when it comes to SROs. I've heard a lot of egregious stories. I've heard of people being arrested in front of their peers for, not charges. Uh, Never mind, even if that were the case, if it were acceptable. But also, in just even trying to have these discussions, I remember doing a panel or a student panel for RTR last August, where some of the participants had been in some of the focus groups for the SRO, and were saying, yeah, no one supported it in these student focus groups, but then the district's report would come out and say that students were neutral, and you just see things like that where it's just like, it's, I don't know, it's just honestly it's disturbing how, you know like, just at every level of the process, what's kind of being done to, one, just make sure SROs aren't touched, but also to just kind of like minimize and really just disrespect students, in my opinion, in this. So that's
Yeah,
my observation. Sorry,
I
go
just
ahead.
think like, why are we putting this funding towards student resource officers when we could be putting it into like maybe mental health care for students more? Like, I just feel like a lot of this funding could go back into programs already established within LO that could use more funding and more like people, staff, just more support in general for students.
Yeah, and in some of my talks with the former superintendent De La Cruz, they tried to, or she tried to tout and say that, there were, and maybe there were, more mental health resources during your time than mine. I would hope, but even then, like what actually, yeah, what was available counseling wise? Were there? Did you have counselors like culturally competent? Like obviously, you didn't have people for like every different, you know, uh, sort of like background, but in terms of like culturally competent counseling, was that was that a thing, or was that more of a thing anyway?
Say there was a little bit more of it. Not much, but it was there. I would say I personally benefited from it, but it was because they hired an Asian like social worker intern. And I would say my identity crises and like issues I had fed into like the Asian American diaspora. And so I was lucky enough to have a counselor that would be able to talk about that. But if I'm thinking of like other students of color, I wouldn't know how much they would be able to benefit from that just because every immigrant story is different. Every story of students of color is different. Every story about just minority communities are different. And I would say the high school counselors, at least at my time, I can't remember mine being that helpful. Um, but they did have they had like a full-time social worker, I remember, and a social worker intern. I saw the intern, and that was really helpful for me. But there was also like, how can these two therapists also serve like all like 1,300 students?
Yeah, it's a slightly tall order. Uh, Kind of transitioning though. So you're at Santa Clara now,
Yes.
and it's always interesting to kind of compare. I think LO in a lot of ways, just because of all the resources at the school, because of just how much money is putting into it. Sometimes it feels like a mini college experience in itself, in some
Hmm.
regards. But yeah, you just compare and contrast. In what ways is Santa Clara, different? But also, what ways are there similarities to your LO experience and you're noticing, or your LO experience that you are noticing?
So I'll start with similarities. This was on my mistake for not doing enough college research. Santa Clara is another PWI, which I found fascinating just because we're in the Bay Area where it's very ethnically diverse. I would say, at least in San Jose, there's a lot of Latino communities, Vietnamese communities, yet it's not really reflected in the university itself. There's definitely a higher percentage, I would say, of like specifically Asian communities. I would say the percent of Black students at Santa Clara is probably similar to Lake Oswego High School. Um, I would say similarities, really rich PWI, kind of getting that LO experience again. But luckily, I have more, I guess, like a higher proportion of people of color that I do surround myself with. Um, I guess some differences. I feel like in Santa Clara, like this is gonna make LO actually sound good, but like I feel like sometimes people here are a little more open about being outwardly racist. There's been a few incidents this year, which is crazy. But other differences I can think of, I would say I do feel, despite it being a PWI where people are a little bit more openly outwardly racist, I do feel a little more comfortable here just because I have a higher proportion of students of color around me and I'm able to have that support still despite my classes being predominantly white. Um yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking mainly in like differences and similarities. It's like it's almost like going to another LO just because it's a PWI, but I still have the benefit of being having just like more people of color around me than I did in at LOHS.
Yeah, yeah, and I imagine just in addition to just like numbers, I don't know, at least like in my experience, I went to University of Oregon. It felt like, again, it's not exactly a high black population by any numbers, but like even with like certain student groups, certain things, there was at least one, they existed, and two, there was like some stated purpose around them, which is always something I'm curious about with LO, because it feels like a lot of one, just a lot of these groups are relatively new with the school. So even like establishing it under what I would call duress from the administration can always be tricky. Um, in a more general sense, though, how would you say your LO experience shapes how you move today, both just like in school, but also just in general?
Yeah. So honestly, with LO, the one thing that I'll say it benefited me with is I learned how to interact from the mind from the mindset of like a minority, I would say, which gave me I would say made me a lot more open-minded and aware of things around me, which I personally really appreciate because honestly, like blissful ignorance sounds great, but realistically, I wouldn't want to live that life. So I will say I appreciate that from all the harm the school district has left me with. But um overall, I would say it made me again, it's like that minority mindset. Like it's like almost like it's weird even being around a bunch of like I would say honestly because like most of my friend group at Santa Clara is Asian. It's weird being around a bunch of Asian kids who didn't have this experience where they were the majority just because most of them are from the Bay Area where there are very Asian dominant high schools where it's like casual racism is directed towards them as out of the blue. Well, when it happens to me, like if it were to happen to me, I'm just like, well, kids in elementary school have done worse to me. So I would say it made me like a tougher and more aware person, but it definitely, I guess, it can suck the soul out of you a little too much. Some if you are in the LO district for too long, I would say.
Mm, mm. So to that end, one thing I'd like to ask everyone on this project is just what advice, if any, could you offer to current students of color, I guess in general, as far as just like uh, getting through this LO experience, getting through this bubble?
Um, honestly, advocate for yourself. That's my number one thing. Um, if reverse of if you can't beat them, join them. If you can't join them, beat them. Do better. You're going to do wonderful things in life if you put the work into yourself. And just remember that the people around you are not going to be in your life forever. So make the most of it. Advocate for yourself and look for your support communities because those are the people that will stick with you forever.
Awesome. Well, Barbara Chen, thank you so much again for taking the time this afternoon.
Yeah, no problem.